Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Have you ever wondered what it truly takes for a child to fall asleep in a place that feels unfamiliar? It's not exhaustion. It's not routine. It's the rare, quiet magic of safety, of being held without question, of knowing that for once, no one will pull you back awake. Every week on this channel, we share stories that whisper more than they shout. Stories that live in the soft moments, in the pauses, in the stillness that follows when someone finally feels seen. And tonight, we invite you into one of those moments, a story that begins with a boy too scared to close his eyes, and a waitress who never intended to change anything, but stayed long enough to let him rest. If you believe that a deep sleep can be the sign of a soul finally finding its shelter, hit that like button and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is listen closely to what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. Now, let's begin. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden shadows across the tiled floor of the small family-owned diner in Portland, Oregon. The place was winding down for the day. Just a few occupied booths remained, and the clatter of silverware was more subdued now, almost respectful, as if the walls themselves knew it was time to quiet down. Laura Mendez wiped down a corner booth with rhythmic, practiced motions. Her hair was pulled back into a low, no-nonsense ponytail, and her apron bore the familiar signs of a long shift: coffee rings, ketchup smears, and a fresh dot of barbecue sauce right at her waistline. She didn't mind. The stains told the story of another day spent moving, serving, watching, listening. Near the window, at a booth halfway down the row, a small boy sat hunched in his seat. His tiny fingers clutched a spoon as if it were the only stable thing in the world. He wasn't eating, just holding it, and his eyes, wide and glassy, darted between the tabletop and the doorway like he was bracing for something. The redness around his lids suggested tears that had been fought but not fully won. Laura noticed the boy in her periphery and paused. Something in the way he folded into himself didn't sit right. She scanned the room, no adults nearby. The man who'd brought the boy in earlier had stepped outside to take a phone call. That was at least 10 minutes ago. Without a word, Laura folded her rag, set it on the counter, and walked toward the boy. She didn't kneel. She didn't reach out abruptly. Instead, she lowered herself onto the floor beside the booth, quietly, calmly, her back resting against the cool wood paneling. From his vantage point, the boy saw her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't look at him directly. She just sat there, eyes gently on the table, letting her presence be known without demanding his attention. After a long pause, she slowly turned her palm upward and rested it on the booth's cushion, not touching him, just there. The boy's name was Ben. He was 6 years old. He had never fallen asleep in public, not once in his life. He had sensory triggers, an acute anxiety disorder, and a nervous system that lit up at every sound, every shift in light, every scent that didn't belong. Richard Eastman, his father, a pharmaceutical magnate known for his punctuality and precision, had consulted the best specialists money could find. None had helped. Sleep for Ben was a thing that came only in silence, in darkness, in rooms that had been tested and retested for comfort. But something about this woman beside him, this stranger who asked for nothing, stilled the static in his mind. Slowly, Ben turned his head. Laura didn't move. He leaned, just barely, resting the side of his face against her upper arm. Her shirt smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and syrup. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply shifted her weight so he could lean more easily. Minutes passed. Then more. Ben's eyelids began to droop. His grip on the spoon loosened. He took a shuddering breath, then another. Laura adjusted her posture, sliding a little closer to the bench, and very gently, as if she were holding a bird's nest, cradled the back of his head in her hand. Her other arm moved to support his shoulders as he slid down into her lap, his body finally yielding to the weight of peace. She didn't check the clock. She didn't glance around. Her knees began to ache from a hard tile floor, but she remained still, arms curled protectively around the child she didn't know. Her apron bunched at her waist, and a sticky patch of barbecue sauce met the soft fabric of the boy's hoodie, but it didn't matter. Outside, a black car door closed. Footsteps approached the diner's entrance. Richard Eastman returned, phone still in his hand, finishing a call that had dragged him away too long. He stepped through the door and froze mid-sentence. His eyes locked onto the booth. There on the floor sat Laura. In her lap his son, curled up like a kitten, mouth slightly open, sleeping. Truly sleeping. In a public place. Without medication. Without fear. Laura didn't look up. She continued to hold Ben's head gently, one hand at the nape of his neck, her thumb unconsciously stroking a strand of his hair. Her own eyes were soft, but alert. She didn't smile. She didn't try to explain. She just stayed where she was, breathing in rhythm with a small chest that rose and fell against her. Richard stood still. For a man who prided himself on controlling every variable in his life, this moment knocked something loose inside him. He'd never seen his son like this, not even at home. Not this calm. Not this safe. The diner hummed quietly around them. The overhead lights flickered gently. Outside, the sun slipped lower, casting amber light across the floor. Time, for once, did not seem to matter. Richard Eastman stood at the entrance of the diner, just inside the doorway, frozen. His phone was still in his hand, the call he'd just ended forgotten entirely. He blinked once, then again, as if trying to process what he was seeing, his son Ben, fast asleep. In public. In the arms of a woman he didn't know. The world tilted slightly. His first instinct, born of years of high-stakes meetings and the constant demand for control, was to act. To step forward, assert authority, reclaim the situation. This was his son, after all. And yet, he didn't move. He took one step, then hesitated. The air felt suddenly delicate, as if even his breath could be too loud. From behind the counter, one of the younger waiters, a kid maybe 20, in a red apron and backward cap, caught his eye and made a small gesture with 2 fingers. A quick, silent motion, palm down, accompanied by the softest whisper, "He's asleep." It landed in Richard's chest like a command. He stopped where he was, lips parted, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with everything he knew about his son. Ben didn't fall asleep without white noise machines calibrated to a specific pitch. Ben didn't fall asleep without a night light on at precisely 27 lumens. Ben didn't fall asleep unless Richard had followed the exact protocol laid out by their specialist in Boston, down to the number of socks in the laundry basket. But there he was. Curled up in this woman's lap, his fingers twitching softly in sleep, his face turned toward her ribs, his mouth slightly open in complete trust. And the woman, Laura, hadn't moved a muscle. Her arms remained gently wrapped around Ben, one hand cradling his neck in the crook of her elbow, the other resting on his back. Her eyes stared forward, unfocused, not meeting Richard's or anyone else's. She breathed slowly, calmly, grounding herself in the moment as if this were the only place she had ever needed to be. 17 minutes passed. Richard didn't count them consciously, but something in him tracked each second. He stood near the host stand, watching silently, the phone in his hand growing warm from the heat of his palm. He didn't know what the protocol was for this, how to interrupt a kindness that felt sacred. Occasionally, other patrons glanced at the scene, but no one said a word. It was as if the entire diner understood that something rare was happening, a truce between fear and comfort, and no one dared to speak too loudly, lest they scare it away. Near the window, an older woman sitting alone picked up her phone and, after a few seconds of internal debate, lifted it discreetly. She captured the moment in a single photo. No flash. No movement. Just a quiet frame, a waitress on the floor, a boy asleep in her arms, and a stillness that reached beyond the picture. Later, she would post it online with a caption. She wasn't serving tables. She was serving peace. But for now, the camera disappeared back into her coat, and she sipped her tea without comment. Richard watched all of it. Watched Laura's shoulders relax further as Ben's breath evened out. Watched the way she adjusted her grip so slightly, just enough to keep his head from slipping. Watched how her eyes, though focused on nothing, seemed to shimmer with something like presence. Not performance. Not pity. Just presence. He didn't know what to make of the ache in his chest. The logical part of him, the CEO, the strategist, the father who organized every part of his son's life into manageable, explainable pieces, couldn't make sense of this. No training. No therapy. No meticulously vetted caregiver had ever done what this woman was doing now, holding his son without expectation, allowing sleep to come on its own, without pressure or prescription. He swallowed hard. He thought about stepping forward again, saying something, anything, but then Ben stirred slightly in her lap, twitching in the half-dream way children do. Laura's hand moved instinctively, brushing his hair back from his temple in a slow, gentle arc. Her eyes softened even further, and she shifted just enough to cradle him more securely. And Richard knew with absolute certainty that if he spoke now, it would all be undone. So he stood there, unmoving, a billionaire in a hand-tailored coat, paralyzed by the sight of his son finally miraculously at peace. That evening, the sky over Portland wore its usual cloak of mist. The city lights bled softly through low clouds, and traffic hummed with the quiet tension of a weekday winding down. In a penthouse apartment that overlooked the river, Richard Eastman sat at the edge of a custom leather couch, his posture rigid, his phone glowing in his hand. He had not spoken during the drive home. Ben had stirred only briefly when lifted from the waitress's arms, blinking in confusion, then slipping back into a half-sleep in the car. He was upstairs now, tucked into bed, staring at the ceiling in complete silence. Richard had checked on him once, then again, and each time found the boy awake, unmoving, eyes wide open. He told himself it was just overstimulation. Maybe too much sugar. Or the lighting at the restaurant. Something. Anything. But as he scrolled through the business emails that had piled up over the last few hours, one thought kept pushing its way to the front of his mind, louder than any board member or quarterly forecast. That woman should not have held his son like that. At exactly 9:27 p.m., Richard opened the feedback portal linked to the diner's receipt and began to type. This is not a complaint about food or service. The issue is about boundaries. One of your employees, dark hair, female, late 20s, chose to physically hold my 6-year-old son in her lap without permission. While I understand the situation may have seemed harmless, my child has a delicate condition and could have been severely startled upon waking. This was an overstep of responsibility and should not have occurred. He hesitated only a moment before pressing send. Across town, Laura Mendez was finishing her shift. The last few tables had been cleared, the dishwasher was clanking in the back, and her knees were still sore from where she'd sat on the floor for nearly 20 minutes. She hadn't spoken much since that moment, just floated through her duties with a quiet that the other staff noticed but didn't question. She didn't expect thanks. She didn't need it. But something about the boy's weight in her arms, the way his breath slowed against her ribs, had stayed with her in a way she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't about being kind. It wasn't about playing hero. It was just letting a small child rest. Without condition. Without instruction. At 10:04 p.m., her manager approached, phone in hand, face unreadable. "Hey Laura," he said softly. "I got a message through the online portal. It's from the father of that little boy. He wasn't happy." Laura's eyes didn't flinch. "He said you shouldn't have held his kid. That you may have scared him. That you crossed a line." There was a pause. The noise of the kitchen behind them seemed to fade. "I see," Laura said calmly. The manager scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I told him you were just trying to help. But, maybe next time, just be more careful about touching customers' kids. It's not part of the job, you know." Laura gave a small nod. Then she looked directly at him and said, with quiet certainty, "I didn't rock him. I didn't whisper to him. I didn't even ask him to come close." Her voice was steady, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I didn't put him to sleep," she continued. "I just didn't wake him up, when he finally did it on his own." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either expected. Her manager didn't know what to say. After a moment, he simply nodded and turned to check the closing checklist, pretending not to be affected by the look in her eyes. The kind of look that came from someone who had once spent nights holding children who screamed themselves hoarse, who had sat beside hospital beds where sleep was not a guarantee, but a fragile victory. Outside, the street was quiet. Laura walked to her car slowly, not out of exhaustion, but something else. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She understood what it meant for a parent to feel out of control. But she also knew the difference between holding on too tightly and simply holding long enough for someone to rest. In another part of the city, Richard stood outside Ben's door again. He could hear the faint rustle of sheets, the shallow breathing of a child still fighting the thing that should come naturally. He reached for the doorknob, then let his hand fall away. And somewhere deep inside, though he wouldn't admit it, not yet, he wondered what would have happened if he had said thank you instead. The silence in the Eastman penthouse was pristine, almost clinical. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a skyline glittering with city lights, but inside, everything was dim and still. Not the comforting kind of stillness, but the kind that buzzed, low and anxious, like a held breath that never quite releases. Ben lay on his bed, rigid beneath a weighted blanket that had been custom-ordered from a specialist in Switzerland. His sheets were crisp, his pillows fluffed to exact specifications, the air purifier hummed at its calibrated frequency. Every element in the room had been designed to support sleep. And yet, his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers to something he couldn't quite ask. His small hands were balled into fists beneath the covers. He didn't twitch, didn't shift. He just waited. For what? He wasn't sure. Maybe for the strange quiet that had wrapped around him at the diner to return. Maybe for the feeling of that woman's arm beneath his cheek, steady and unhurried. Maybe for her scent, some mix of syrup, lemon cleaner, and something warm that didn't smell like money or medicine. Richard stood just outside the doorway, not quite entering the room. His hand gripped the edge of the wall, thumb absently rubbing the molding. He had peeked in once, then twice, but never crossed the threshold. He could see his son's eyes reflecting the soft amber light from the hallway. How was it possible, he thought, that the most sophisticated environment money couldn't accomplish what a stranger on a diner floor had managed by doing absolutely nothing? Time passed. The clock on Ben's dresser shifted from 9:58 to 10:32. And still, the boy didn't sleep. Finally, in a voice so soft Richard almost missed it, Ben spoke. "Dad." Richard straightened, but didn't move forward. Ben blinked slowly. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. "Do you know that place?" he began, then paused. His throat moved in a small swallow. "It felt warmer than our house." Richard's jaw tensed. He didn't know how to respond to that. Not because he disagreed, but because he knew with sudden, shattering clarity that Ben wasn't talking about temperature. The thermostat in their home was digitally set to the recommended optimal sleep environment for a child with anxiety, 68.4 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's not what the boy had meant. Richard opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. His son had just told him the most vulnerable truth he'd ever dared to say out loud. That safety, real safety, had been found not in a perfectly constructed bedroom, but in a stranger's lap, amid the faint scent of fried potatoes and spilled soda. And Richard had no idea how to hold that truth. So he stayed outside the room. He watched Ben roll slightly onto his side, eyes still open, staring at nothing. Not restless. Just unable. The minutes ticked by. Richard leaned his shoulder against the wall, arms folded. He didn't go back to his office. Didn't check his phone. Didn't draft the list of action items he usually prepared before bed. He just stood there, breathing as quietly as he could, like he might accidentally wake something precious if he moved too suddenly. Sometime around midnight, Ben closed his eyes for 30 seconds, then opened them again. Richard saw it happen. He didn't sigh. He didn't scold. He didn't remind Ben to just try. He only watched, helpless in the way only a parent can be when faced with the limits of love that tries too hard and listens too little. He stayed outside Ben's door the entire night. No words. No intervention. Just presence, awkward, belated, and silent. And though neither of them slept, something had shifted. Not enough to fix anything, but enough to finally feel the space between them. The next morning, Richard sat across from Dr. Harriet Lindell in her private office on the upper floor of a quiet medical building in northwest Portland. The room was tastefully furnished, oak shelves, a velvet armchair in the corner, the faint scent of chamomile drifting from a diffuser on the windowsill. But Richard wasn't interested in her decor. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, suit jacket still unbuttoned from the night before. The shadows under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night, though he hadn't spoken of it. Ben hadn't slept. Not a minute. And Richard hadn't left the hallway outside his son's room. Dr. Lindell observed him silently for a moment. She had been Ben's pediatric behavioral specialist for nearly 2 years, trusted, thorough, and unafraid to speak plainly. Which is exactly why Richard had come to her this morning without an appointment. He rubbed his temple. Then, with more hesitation than usual, asked the question that had been eating at him since sunrise. What if, he paused. What if he only falls asleep now, when someone's next to him? Dr. Lindell folded her hands. You mean, what if he needs the presence of another person to reach a state of rest? She clarified. Richard nodded. Yes. That. The doctor tilted her head slightly. It wouldn't be unusual, especially for children with anxiety. But are we talking about just anyone? He looked down. No. I don't think so. She waited. Finally, he spoke again. It's this woman. A waitress, from a diner we visited yesterday. She held him. He fell asleep in her arms. First time ever in public. No meds. No prep. Just sleep. He looked up at her then, eyes searching for logic, an explanation, anything to make it make sense. Dr. Lindell was quiet for a beat. Then she asked, and you've tried replicating the conditions since? I stayed outside his door all night, Richard admitted. He didn't even blink. Just lay there, staring at the ceiling. Another pause. Then, without ceremony, she said, it's not just someone. It's that someone. Richard frowned. I don't understand. Dr. Lindell smiled gently, not condescending but knowing. Children don't respond to roles. They respond to energy, to tone, to presence. You can train someone to be a caregiver, a therapist, a specialist. But what your son felt with her, whoever she is, was something you can't train. It's connection. Spontaneous. Pure. She leaned back in her chair. And it sounds like it gave him something even our best interventions couldn't. Richard exhaled, slow and uneven. He didn't like variables. He didn't like the unknown. But the more he tried to reject this truth, the more it settled into his chest like a stone. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened the photo. It was the image someone had taken at the diner, the one that had made its way online, passed around with thousands of quiet, reverent comments. He stared at it for a long time. Laura was sitting on the tile floor, legs tucked beneath her, one arm curved around Ben, the other resting lightly on his back. Her posture wasn't perfect. Her uniform bore the stains of a long shift. Her hair was falling out of its tie. But her head was tilted, slightly to the right. Her cheek brushed against Ben's temple. And her eyes were closed. Not in exhaustion. Not in performance. But in peace. She had fallen asleep too. The realization hit Richard like a breath he hadn't noticed he was holding. It wasn't just that she had allowed Ben to rest. She had joined him in it. In that brief sliver of time, in the din of a diner full of noise and clatter, they had created a silence that held them both. And no one had orchestrated it. No therapist had scheduled it. No evaluation had prepared for it. It just happened. He stared at the image a little longer, fingers brushing the screen like it might answer back. Then gently, he pressed the phone to his chest. The diner was quieter than usual that afternoon. The lunch rush had passed, and the few remaining customers lingered over coffee and quiet conversation. Outside, the early winter light cast soft reflections on the window glass, giving the place a muted, amber glow. Laura was restocking the condiments at table 7 when the door opened. She didn't look up at first. The bell above the entrance chimed softly, familiar, routine. She figured it was a regular or someone coming in for pie and silence. But then she heard the hush that followed. Not discomfort, not tension, just stillness. She turned, and there he was. Richard Eastman. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the afternoon light behind him outlining the tailored cut of his coat, the silver at his temples, the faint crease between his brows. But his expression was different from the day before, not stern, not tight. Just quiet. Their eyes met. Laura didn't flinch. She gave a small nod, polite but unreadable, and turned back to the ketchup bottles. He didn't speak. Instead, he walked slowly to the counter and reached into the inner pocket of his coat. From it, he pulled a small white envelope, nothing ornate, no embossed logo or calligraphy. Just a folded card, thick and clean, with a name handwritten in simple blue ink, Laura. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't ask for her attention. He placed it gently on the edge of the counter, where she could see it but wouldn't have to take it right away. Then he stepped back. No explanation. No apology. No speech. Laura glanced down at the envelope. She didn't move immediately, just finished aligning the salt shakers with calm, measured care. Only after Richard had walked to the door, almost fully turned to leave, did she pick it up. She opened it slowly, unfolding the single card inside. On it, in the same deliberate handwriting, were the words, "If there's ever a space for someone who helps Ben sleep, please write her name on that seat." Ari. There was no logo. No signature. Just that. Laura stood still for a long moment, eyes scanning the note again, fingers brushing its edges. Her face remained unreadable, but something in her shoulders eased. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small square of receipt paper. No hesitation. She grabbed the pen from behind her ear, uncapped it with one hand, and scribbled something quickly, with the same ease she used to jot down customer orders. Then, without looking up, she walked over to the door where Richard now stood, half-turned as if unsure whether to leave or linger. She held out the folded note. He took it, carefully. Only once he'd stepped outside did he open it. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the words, "The boy doesn't need me. He just needs someone who won't wake him up. The moment he finally believes he's safe to sleep." LM. Richard stared at the words. There was no irony. No anger. No request. Just a statement of truth, soft, but pointed. The kind that didn't ask for understanding, but offered it anyway. He stood there on the sidewalk, the wind brushing past his coat, the note trembling slightly in his hand. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a CEO holding data. He felt like a father holding something fragile and real. Something earned, not bought. He folded the note once, twice, then placed it gently back into his coat. Behind the glass, Laura had returned to her tables. Nothing about her posture suggested pride or regret. She moved as she always did, with quiet rhythm, with purpose, with attention to small things. She hadn't done any of this to be noticed. Which, Richard realized, might be exactly why she had been. 2 weeks later, Laura walked quietly down the long hallway of the Eastman Pediatric Therapy Center. It was a soft-lit space, designed with muted colors and rounded edges, an intentional effort to make children feel safe. But none of the decor explained why she was here today. She had said yes. Not to a job. Not to a title. But to something Richard had called, with careful words, a companion role. "I don't want you to be staff," he'd said. "I want you to be a person Ben trusts. Someone whose presence doesn't depend on schedules or charts." Laura had taken a few days to decide. Not because she doubted Ben, but because she respected what it meant to show up for someone who needed more than professionalism. She finally agreed, with one condition. "If I'm here, I'm not here to fix anything. Just to sit in the dark if that's what he needs." Now, she entered the observation room through a side door, her footsteps soft against the carpet. Inside the therapy circle, 5 children sat with crayons and sketchpads, each absorbed in their own small universe. A therapist guided from the side, offering gentle questions about color and shape, nothing invasive. Ben was the only one sitting in someone's lap. Laura's lap. He wasn't clinging. He wasn't hiding. He just leaned back into her comfortably, as if her presence had become an extension of himself. His knees were drawn up slightly, socked feet balanced on the chair. In his hands, he held a thick blue crayon, pressed tightly between his fingers. He was drawing. Richard sat behind the one-way glass, arms crossed, not in judgment, but restraint. He didn't want to interrupt what he was witnessing. He wasn't sure he even had the language for it. He had offered this invitation to Laura out of a sense of quiet desperation. He hadn't expected her to accept. And even after she did, he feared it might unravel. That the magic of that one night might not survive the daylight of routine. But what he saw now wasn't magic. It was something steadier. A rhythm. Ben shifted slightly, resting the side of his head against Laura's collarbone. She adjusted her arm just enough to steady him, never looking away from the page he was coloring. Her movements were instinctive, unpracticed yet perfect. The therapist walked past and smiled at them briefly, then moved on without comment. After a few more minutes, Ben held up his paper. He didn't say anything. He simply turned his head and handed it to Laura. She looked down. The drawing was simple, childlike, crayon strokes forming 2 shapes, a small figure curled up against a larger one. The background was faint, like a shadow, but the arms were bold, outlined thickly, as if that was the part Ben needed to emphasize. At the top of the page, in uneven but deliberate handwriting, were the words, "This is my bed." Her arms. Laura blinked once, then looked at Ben. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He just leaned back into her, utterly content. Richard, behind the glass, felt something in his chest shift. He didn't cry. But his throat tightened, and his fingers closed slowly around the edge of his chair. All this time, he'd built the perfect room. Bought the best sleep tech. Trained himself to track schedules and manage behavioral plans. And yet, here was his son, finally at rest, finally expressing it, not through therapy goals, but through the language of a crayon drawing and the safety of 2 human arms. He hadn't expected healing to look like this. He hadn't known it could. As the group began to wrap up, Ben stayed right where he was. He didn't rush to leave. He didn't ask to go home. He remained in Laura's lap, watching as the other children shuffled away. The therapist approached and gave a small nod toward Richard, behind the glass. Richard nodded back. They wouldn't need to analyze this session. The data was already written, in crayon, in posture, in the way Ben didn't flinch when someone touched the lights on their way out. He hadn't needed a nightlight today. He hadn't needed white noise. For the first time in his life, Ben had fallen into rest with nothing but the feeling of being held. If you believe that some of the most healing kinds of rest don't come from soft pillows or warm lamps, but from a presence patient enough to let you breathe at your own pace, then take a moment to like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Every week, we share a story that reminds us, stillness isn't always silence. And peace doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes, it's just someone who stays. Quietly. Gently. Until you're ready to let go. And tell us in the comments. Who was the last person you leaned into, who didn't wake you, when you finally began to drift off?